Hello everyone, so today's going to be a little bit different of a video. We're not going to be talking about the CTS3 per se, but what you should be monitoring on your 7.3 power strokes. Now, the 7.3 is kind of unique being a HEUI injection system. It's a little bit of a special animal, and there's some things you really need to be looking at that you might not know you're supposed to be looking at. So everything on this CTS3 is done through the OBD2 port. This is all PIDs that the truck can naturally see. One thing I wish that the CTS3 was able to see that it's not able to is actually the mat sensor, which is basically your charge temperature after the intercooler. It's a sensor that sits right on the intake spider on the 7.3, at least on the Super Duties, and it does a really good job at telling us how efficient our turbo is, how the intercooler is performing, basically the temperature after the turbo, after the intercooler, going into the actual engine. But it's not super important. It's just something I wish that the CTS3 was able to do. But we're going to talk about what you should be looking out for. So before you tune your truck, before you really do anything with your truck, you should be looking and data logging it to see the health, because there's a lot of things you could look at on your Super Duty, on your OBS, and be able to really get a good idea of the health of the truck. So many people start throwing aftermarket tunes in these trucks without even knowing what the status of their exhaust back pressure sensor is. And yes, that is important. Seeing what your IPR is, what your injection pressure is, the health of your HPO. These trucks live and die by fuel pressure and high pressure oil. I've said it many, many times. And there's so many new owners out there. I see it every day on Facebook, and this video isn't to talk down to anybody. It's probably going to be really basic information for a lot of you. But I just want to try to help out some of the new guys out there, and maybe even some of you guys have been around for a little bit. So let's dive into it. These are my personal PIDs that I like to monitor. Now, two things that you cannot see on the 7.3 is obviously your exhaust gas temperature. There's no sensor for it stock unless you add it. And then also fuel pressure. Not talking about high pressure oil injection pressure. We're talking about the actual fuel pressure coming from the lift pump. Now on your OBS guys, you're going to be like 40, 45 PSI, something like that. On your Super Duty guys, you should be about 60-ish PSI, 55, 60. My truck personally, I have a gauge off of the port at the fuel filter housing, and mine runs at 70 PSI. I've got an aftermarket spring in it. Most guys will tell you about 65 is a sweet spot. Really important to know, even if you can't monitor while you're driving, it's good to know. Even if you can just see what it is at idle or at free rev, it's a good thing to have. So one thing that the CTS cannot see. The other thing is get you an EGT gauge, especially if you're going to be running anything more than a very, very mild tune. Most tuners will tell you regardless you need an EGT gauge, even if you have a 40 horsepower tune. My experience is most of those 30, 40 horsepower tunes run pretty soft. It's not absolutely a must, but for reliability reasons, I'm going to tell you if you have a tuned truck, get an EGT gauge. The CTS3 does have the ability to be expanded and be able to tell you your fuel pressure. You can add many, many gauges to it, including EGT. That's an option, or you can just get you an analog gauge, whatever you want. But as far as PIDs for the CTS3, or if you're running 4Scan, boost, not super important. I like to see it whenever I'm towing or pulling hills, but it's not a must. On your Super Duties, if you run anything over 23 PSI, you're gonna need a boost puller because it's gonna freak out the map sensor. The map sensor is not capable of seeing anything over about 23, maybe 24 PSI, and then we'll start throwing random numbers. And some tuners will tune it out by turning off the low fuel tables. I'm not a huge fan of that. I prefer to keep mine in place, so therefore I run a boost puller. So this boost gauge will never see over 23 PSI, but that's okay. It's not really super relevant. It just tells me that when I'm pulling a hill and I've got 10 to 15 PSI, I know I'm where I'm supposed to be. IPW, this one is ignored a lot. Injector pulse width. This is really important. On a stock tune, your injector pulse width at wide open throttle should be about 3.00. It's going to vary a little bit. On a very mild tune, you're probably going to be something like 3.5. On a really aggressive tune, you may be upwards of 4.0. If you start seeing something like over 4.5 at wide open throttle, unless you have some really crazy custom tuning or super aggressive tune, something is probably going on. You're probably dropping your ICP, or your injection control pressure. This is your high pressure oil pressure that's being measured off of the driver's side front head. I run a crossover tube on mine, so this is actually reading both of the banks from the high pressure oil pump, but typically it'll just be reading off the driver's side because they're not connected unless you have a crossover tube of some sort. If this starts dropping off really bad, sometimes your injection pulse width will try to compensate, and that's how you can tell. If you're getting like 4.5 or more and you're on a mild tune, your high pressure oil pump is probably not keeping up, or you've got other issues. Exhaust back pressure, often overlooked. People will tell you can delete it. Do not. It can affect everything from cold starts on your truck to the truck's ability to idle to even your fueling tables. It has a lot of things that it takes into account. It takes this, the computer, the PCM takes this number into account, and in coordination with boost pressure. So if you just delete this, or if your tube's broken off or it's clogged, you may have some drivability issues. You may have starting issues. Unless you, once again, have some really custom tuning where this is just not a factor anymore. For 99% of you, make sure your exhaust back pressure is working. It should be, in my experience, usually about 3 to 4 PSI at idle. It depends on your exhaust. It depends on a lot of other factors. If you're getting like 0 reading on this at idle and only seeing a peak of like 6 or 8 PSI, you have a problem. You have a leak, it's clogged, the sensor's bad, fix it. Battery voltage, self-explanatory, but I like to be able to see my battery voltage. I like to be able to see that my charging system is working in real time. Yes, I have the gauge on the dash, but this just tells me it's doing what it's supposed to do. Typically, I see around 14.0 to 14.3, depending on how the truck is doing. Fun fact, this actually saved my butt one time because I was having an issue and my battery light was on. We could not figure it out. It wasn't the batteries were testing good. The alternator tested good, but we were still seeing like at idle 10.5 volts, and then while cruising it would only get up to like 12 volts. The glow plug controller, or sorry, the glow plug relay that the previous owner had installed had actually stuck in the on position, so the glow plugs were trying to run constantly. That was pulling the voltage down massively. Disconnect the glow plug relay, and guess what? The charging system was working perfectly fine. It was a cheap Chinese aftermarket relay, put a factory OEM one in from Ford, and it ran perfectly fine. Moving on. Engine oil temperature, or EOT. Really important, especially if you're working the truck hard. Really, a lot of that is subject to climate. You know, if you're in a really hot climate, your EOT is going to stay much higher. I like having my EOT because we live in a very, very wide-ranging climate. We use the truck all over the East Coast, and sometimes we might be a place that's really cold. I don't like to move my truck until the oil temperature is up at a good like 60 or 70 degrees. I don't like to put a load on it. If I'm towing, I don't like to move it until it's over 100 degrees. If you live out in Arizona or something, that might not be an issue. You're probably trying to keep the truck under a certain point, and that might be 210, 220 degrees, whatever your preference might be. Realistically, by about 230 degrees, I would say would be the highest I would want to run my oil up to. Now, it might depend if I was towing up a big hill or something, you know, might push it slightly further, but definitely by about 240, I'm going to want to be letting that cool back down. TFT, transmission temperature. So if you're running automatic, that's going to be really important, especially if you don't have an updated valve body, or if you don't have a 6.0 oil cooler for the transmission cooler or something of that nature. Your transmission temperatures are really important to monitor on your 4R100. It's critical. If you start getting over about 210 degrees towing, I would say you probably are still good. If you're running 210 degrees unloaded and you're not in Arizona or Texas, I would start wondering about the health of your transmission. But towing, it's not uncommon to get them up there, especially in stock form, 220, 230 degrees. I would not be afraid to run your transmission up to 230 degrees pulling a big hill, but if you're hitting that frequently, it's going to shorten the life of your transmission. That's just my opinion. Some people will argue about it. And I mean, I personally had a 4L60 up to 240 before towing. I've had a 4R100 actually up to 240 before towing. Then had a place to get off on a really tight back road, and it was slower speeds. Unfortunately, it worked out for me. I didn't kill the truck, I didn't kill the transmission, but I did end up significantly upgrading the oil pan, and I added a secondary transmission cooler on the front. And after that, we never really got over like 210, 220. So moving down, IPR percentage. IPR is really important. It tells you basically how much flow is going to the injectors. At about 45%, your IPR is giving your injectors as much high pressure oil as they're going to get. It's not a 100% thing. At about 45%, it's probably getting everything the oil pump can provide for it. And that's why IPR is so important. It tells you the health of your high pressure oil pump in a way, along with your ICP pressure. If you're hitting 39%, say you've got a load on it, you've got a small trailer, you're going up a hill and you hit wide open throttle, and you see 2600 PSI on your ICP, and only about, we'll say 39 or 40% on your IPR, and you're in a mild tune, you're doing pretty good. Your high pressure oil pump is making the pressure it's supposed to. Your IPR is not all the way open, or at least it's not commanding itself all the way open. We can't really see the true IPR percentage, but we can see what is being commanded by the PCM. You're doing okay. If you're doing the same scenario, you're pulling a hill in a mild tune and you're hitting 46 or 47% and you're only making 2200 PSI, guess what? Your HPO is probably getting a little bit weak. Your IPR is giving the injectors as much high pressure oil as it has, and it's not able to maintain that pressure that it's trying to get to. Some tuners will command 55, 60, 65%. I get it, but really once you get past that 45, maybe 50% range, that's it. The IPR is giving it everything it's got. And so those two numbers, your ICP and your IPR, really go a long way to telling the health of your high pressure oil pump. And this is why it's important to monitor and know your truck. Finally for me, intake air temp. So I still have a stock airbox on this truck, believe it or not. It works just fine for me. It keeps everything nice and quiet. Right now we're sitting in the parking lot, obviously we're idling, but typically if I'm driving around, I'm seeing 1 to 2 degrees over ambient temperature, which I like, because if I'm traveling up and down the East Coast, so I go from Virginia to Pennsylvania, or maybe even just going up a mountain in Virginia, I can see what the temperature is when I get out of the truck. And sometimes, you know, it's just nice to know for the type of work I do. Oh, it was 45 degrees when I left the house, now it's 55 degrees. Or it was 55 degrees when I left, I don't know, Salem or whatever city I might be in, and then I get up to this mountain and I'm, you know, 10 or 15 degrees cooler. Just a good thing to know. That's just my personal preference. I also like to know that it's working, but it gives me just a good idea of the surrounding temperature. So the final one is obviously gear TCL. That's right below the ICP, right here in the center-ish. And for me, it's always good to know what gear I'm in and if my torque converter is locked out or not. Obviously, I drive the truck enough. I generally know if I'm in 3rd gear, 4th gear, or if the converter is locked. But sometimes, especially if I'm towing a load that I don't typically tow and it's a different weight than I'm used to, sometimes it's good just to have that reference there. So I want to reiterate, there are two that I talked about beginning. Your fuel pressure on these trucks is really important. Definitely get a gauge. Even if it's just a cheap gauge that you mount on the test port on your fuel filter housing. It's better than nothing. Obviously, it's better to have one in the cab if you can, or have one connected to your CTS3 or whatever monitor you might use, but it's still good to have. And then obviously exhaust gas temperature. If you're not confident in tapping your exhaust manifold, you can add one right after the turbo in the downpipe. That is an option if you're not confident in doing your exhaust manifolds. That's okay. Something is better than nothing. Just realize that if you go that route, you're going to see about 100, 150, sometimes upward of 200 degrees lower temperature at the downpipe than what you would see in the exhaust manifold. depending on how far away you put it from the turbo. So just keep that in mind. But once again, I'm not going to knock somebody that has one in the downpipe. It's obviously better in the exhaust manifold, but you can make it do, and whatever works best for you, you know, personal preference there. But anyway, guys, I did not expect this video to be almost 20 minutes long, so I'm gonna jump off here. I really hope this helps you guys. This is just my opinion and what works for me. Obviously, if you've got a manual transmission, some of these aren't going to be relevant to you, but it's what I find is important. And once again, what I would say are the three biggest. I know everybody wants to run a boost gauge. If I had to pick three gauges, it would be high pressure oil, it would be exhaust gas temperature, and it would be fuel pressure. Those would be the three that I would absolutely get on a 7.3 Power Stroke. Now, having something like the CTS3 is nice, or running 4Scan. 4Scan is cheap if you don't have the money to spend on a CTS3, or you want something that does more than a CTS3. 4Scan is the way to go. But if nothing else, get those three gauges. I'm not a huge fan of the Maxto series gauges, but they work. They're good for the money. And then I believe that they've even got a lower line under that you can get that is like 200 or 300 bucks for a whole set. If that's your thing, go for it. But anyway, this has been too long. I hope you all have a good day. Be safe, as always, all the way. If you like this video, it helped, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.